Welcome to the ISF Podcast from the Information Security Forum. The ISF Podcast is hosted by ISF CEO Steve Durbin, and every episode he brings listeners features timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. Today's episode features an interview with Steve and Kavita Kadambi, the CISO for Infosys, the Indian multinational IT consulting firm. Steve addresses how organizations can securely adopt AI, considers how this emerging technology might change the way we work, and looks at how businesses can make themselves resilient in the face of emerging threats.
I'm so glad that we're able to have this conversation today. Thank you so much for your time amidst your very busy schedule, Steve.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So let me start with a topic that has been making headlines, Steve, more so this year, ChatGPT and AI. There has been mixed responses across organizations and worldwide in terms of embracing ChatGPT wholeheartedly. What do you think are the latent risks that organizations need to be aware of while adopting the large language models, given the biases, ethical concerns, privacy issues, data purity and integrity concerns, amongst others?
It's a great way to start this fireside chat, isn't it? Not too difficult at all. What do I think about ChatGPT? It's very rare that I go anywhere today now and talk to either members or boards of directors without them asking me about ChatGPT and what my views are. And I think that there are really two elements to it as far as I'm concerned. The first is where organizations are using artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, in-house. So where they have some constraints around how it's being used, monitored, and so on. And then the way that it's being used, perhaps in a much more general, external fashion. And it all comes down to controls. I think if we look back at, artificial intelligence, ChatGPT in particular, how that has evolved, at the ISF, we've been talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence for probably something like the last, 7 or 8 years. And we've highlighted it in our threat reports. We've drawn attention to it from a security standpoint. Now, why have we done that? There are two principal reasons. The first is that artificial intelligence thrives on data. In order for artificial intelligence to be effective, it requires data. The more data you give it, the better the results you get coming out of it. But within that, there is an inherent problem. Because if the data that you're giving to the artificial intelligence has bias in it, perhaps has been tweaked or changed, outputs that are being produced clearly will present challenges when it comes down to the business making use of those directions or ways in which artificial intelligence is determining that perhaps a program should be operating. So what does all of that mean? We can't turn back the clock. We can't stop people from using this kind of thing. I think from the security standpoint, what we do have to do is really embark on quite an aggressive program of education and awareness, is how I would put it. I think that we have to try to be as intimately involved as possible in our organizations in the way that the organization is determining the use of artificial intelligence. So that, yes, we understand the business direction. We're not going to stop that. But we also need to understand how we can really ensure the integrity of the data that's being used, how we can train the people who are inputting data and using the outputs from that data, and how we can also challenge, and perhaps most importantly, ensure that we have some form of check and balance across the whole space. And that's hugely important because there is no such thing at the moment as a regulatory landscape when it comes to AI. It's still in very formative years. So the onus falls back on the organization. And I think this is an important point around ChatGPT, because obviously ChatGPT in the public domain is constantly learning. And that's hugely exciting. Because if you think about the number of people that are using it, But from a security standpoint, we also need to make our employees very, very aware that they should not be putting corporate sensitive information, and I would go so far as to say personally sensitive information, into a public artificial intelligence platform over which you have no control. So there are a couple of things in that, I think. From the corporate standpoint, it's about education. It's about really trying to put in place your own form of governance in the absence of any regulatory guidelines around that are formed anyway. And also, I think, just making sure that from a security standpoint, we know what's going on so that where necessary, we can actually pull a kill switch.
Sure, sure. I think what you said is absolutely right, Steve. And I think this is something that a lot of organizations are embarking upon. They're embarking on their journeys in multiple ways. And while in this whole process of putting together the entire governance around it, how do you go ahead and address big data? How do you address the awareness? We will continue to see threat actors weaponizing AI tools for targeted social engineering and a range of cyber attacks. And I think we will probably see more of that because this is now possible. What, according to you, is a safe approach to AI adoption? And do you think there are, examples that you might have, real life examples of social engineering, which, we need to be aware of and what we can go ahead and leverage and use?
Yeah, I think there is a sad fact, isn't there, that for every advance in technology where it is being put to good use, we also have to take that somewhat jaundiced perspective from a security standpoint that threat actors, bad actors, nation state sponsored actors will also have access to that technology and will use it for quite a different means. And I'm sure that people watching this, can think of a number of different examples already, because there have been so many that have been made public in terms of how deepfakes, for instance, have found their way out into the wild, ranging from very individual level, people being duped into parting with significant amounts of money. And, some people may be thinking, well, artificial intelligence, surely you need to have, quite an amount of understanding of the way in which the tools operate and so on. And sadly, that isn't the case. As we've seen with the way in which cybercrime has developed, there are now very sophisticated threat actors that really provide crime as a service. And artificial intelligence is the next stage in that. So the prevalence of things like help desks, the prevalence of 24/7 support, money-back guarantees where things don't work, those are all the reality of cybercrime today. And so putting that into the artificial intelligence context, because we spend so much time on the internet, on the web, because we spend so much time on things like Instagram, Twitter, X, as it's now known, posting pictures, audio files, it doesn't take much to capture some of that, tweak it with some artificial intelligence software. And before you know it, you've got a very living, breathing deepfake that is hugely credible. So those are some of the things that we need to be really, really aware of when we move into this space. And of course, what we don't want to do is we don't want to stop artificial intelligence being used for good. So if we think of all of the different examples, perhaps in the medical space, more commercially, perhaps in marketing, in things like predictive analytics, it's a whole range of different areas where artificial intelligence is really delivering very sound business benefit. But our job in security is also to look at the flip side. And so it is about, again, raising the level of awareness within our organizations about how to spot deepfakes, raising the level of education around what to do if you think that there is some level of deepfake or that you have been duped in some way, shape or form. It's particularly relevant around financial transactions, of course, within the corporation, because threat actors know very well that at certain times in a week, perhaps employees are under more pressure than at others, and so they can drop certain elements into the mix that would perhaps encourage somebody to transfer significant amounts of money because somebody's claiming to be the CFO and they have to get that transfer done. And very few people like to go up and challenge a CFO at, say, 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So, from a security standpoint, again, it is about us getting the balance right. We need to be very, very aware of some of the things that are going on there, and this is where organizations like my own really come into their own, because of course ISF members share that kind of information. And that's what's so important. We're trying to raise our level of awareness so that we in turn can raise the level of awareness of the business so that we can protect our assets.
And I think while on the one hand, there has been a higher adoption of AI into cybersecurity space itself, the cybersecurity tools which are out there for all the things around protection, they have gone ahead and leveraged AI. Perhaps the flip side around cybersecurity for AI probably is the larger threat that we perceive, isn't that? I think that's what we're saying, right, Steve? Yes, I think so, and I think these are even more so given where we stand in the financial services, the kind of transactions that we see out there and the likes. And it is not just in the corporate world, but also in the personal space, because given how there is so much of a blur around some of these at this point in time, and we have to be conscious and cautious at the same time around this. Absolutely. So well said. You have been very, very active in this space, and I got this interesting article of yours where you talk about AI optimists versus AI pessimists. It's a very intriguing spectrum to discuss. So how do you perceive the world would react, say, in about 10 years to these two ends of the spectrum? And where do you see the journey of responsible AI? And everybody's been talking about responsible AI for quite some time now. It's not just because of ChatGPT, but it's been there for a while. How do you see this journey of responsible AI getting used, developing, and panning out? What is your view around this?
Yeah, and I think, I move along that spectrum depending on which day of the week it is. So you'll catch me on a good day when I'm an AI optimist, and then you'll catch me on a bad day when I'm an AI pessimist, depending on what I've seen, what I've been involved in. And I think that is the nature of it at the moment, because it is a very rapidly evolving, changing space, which makes it fascinating to work in. And also means that nobody really knows how it's going to end up. So, 10 years out, I'd probably have a go at 10 months with a degree of certainty. 10 years, I have no clue. But I think if I look at it from a sort of 10-month perspective, then I think that what we are starting to see, obviously, is a much higher level of awareness. That's really important. People have to be aware of what's possible, what isn't possible, and what to watch out for from a security standpoint in all of this. I think that we will also start to see some form of governance and regulation coming in. We have to. Now, depending on who you talk to, whether it be the optimists or the pessimists in this space, some will call for almost a moratorium on development, on public development in AI, to slow things down a bit. And I think that's a reflection on just how very, very fast this space is changing. And for it's probably just worth us thinking about what we're talking about here, because AI depends on data. The more data you feed it, the more it comes up with. So the more people that you have interacting with public AI means the more it's developing, the faster it's growing, the greater its capabilities. And there is this balance that needs to be struck. And so I think there is a role for external regulation, and it's very unusual for me to say that. People who've heard me speak on this sort of topic before will be quite surprised, I think, to hear me coming down in favor of regulation, because that's not a stance that I normally take. But I do think this is one instance where we need to have some very sound guidelines around how we actually use it, so that we can try to bring some form of control back into the whole development cycle. But we're going to see a continuing evolution of things like intelligent autonomous vehicles that uses artificial intelligence. We're going to see, I think, some really exciting developments on the medical side. That's probably one of the areas where I'm most interested, to be honest, because, again, if you can put AI with some form of large-scale computing into that space, then you do have the ability to really change lives for the good. And for me, that's where we should be focusing AI. I'm not such a fan of AI when it comes to, autonomous vehicles and that kind of thing. But I am when we get into how we can make really life-changing difference. And I think that's the real pot of gold at the end of the AI rainbow. How we get there, of course, is another thing. And I think that because, as we've just been talking about, everything that is used for good can also be used for bad, there needs to be a better understanding of the way in which some of these tools can be used, how they might be controlled and probably regulated to a certain extent in certain areas. And I would hope certainly that over the coming 10 months, 12 months, we start to see a little bit more in that space in particular, because there's absolutely no doubt that we're going to see very much more development from an AI standpoint. We're going to see a whole host of different applications that are coming out, some of which we've got no clue about at the moment. And that makes, as I said earlier, for a very, very exciting space to be operating in. But from a security standpoint, it's also going to increase our workload and probably contribute to a few more headaches along the way, which is probably the last thing that security people listening to this want to hear.
Absolutely. And I think all of us have been pondering on this ever since this whole explosion that we have seen over the last few months, right? So building on this, Steve, it's interesting, right? There's the whole thing around AI and generative AI in particular. There has been a lot of things around having markers out there to say what is machine generated more and more data vis-a-vis non-machine generated, and different organizations are having different approaches around it. And there is the view that this might become potentially recursive or infinite, and hence it could snowball into something which could be much bigger, which will have very, very different implications on cybersecurity, including not knowing whether threat actors are real, threat actors are machines, and the likes. Do you have some point of view around this, Steve?
Yeah, I do. And I think if you go back just a few years with our Threat Horizon report series, we talked about this potential situation of AI going up against AI. So bad AI going up against good AI. And what happens in that scenario? Who wins? Because they're both learning from each other as it goes along. And it's a real conundrum to try to work that one out. From a cybersecurity standpoint, my ideal situation, I think, as to how we work with AI should be that we still have people involved where they can add value, where they're overseeing what's going on. Now, I think there are some really good uses for artificial intelligence in terms of things like network monitoring, for instance. Nobody wants to do network monitoring. It's dull, it's boring. Machines are perfect at it. So let them do that bit. And then let's have the cybersecurity staff that we've got really add value to some of the things that we need to do. And I would put them more into the people-facing things, things like the awareness, the education, and things that we've talked about for many, many years and never managed to crack. So for me, AI in cybersecurity, the way that we use it in cybersecurity, frees up limited resource to be able to do things that they don't have time to do, and offload some of those perhaps less interesting tasks. But one of those big conundrums is what happens when bad AI meets good AI, and who wins? And that I don't know. And I think, again, there is probably going to be some need for human intervention to just even that one out, to mix things up a little bit, to cause the bad AI to miss a beat, because suddenly we behave in a way that we don't. And that's the benefit of having humans involved in cybersecurity. And that's why I would never outsource it all to an artificial intelligence, because people are people and we do quirky, strange things that cannot be predicted. And that, I think, is the only solution to a situation where you have, AI going at it like that. You have to suddenly drop someone in there who's going to behave completely out of the norm. So I think there's still a future for people, and I'm very hopeful and grateful for that.
That's gratifying to know, and I'm glad that we have one more champion on that one. So thanks, Steve. I think very interesting thoughts. So let me move to a completely different space, right? There's so much of AI that we've spoken about. It's completely different. I mean, we're living in very volatile times. We have all these, on the one hand, all of these challenges that we've had on AI and the likes, which is all the technology disruption that we're seeing and continuous disruption that we're seeing. On the other hand, we have the geopolitical and the socioeconomic disruptions also that we have seen. And then we've had this absolute need to embrace digital transformation initiatives to thrive. And we've had these multiple instances where the world has been disrupted over and over because of multiple events just in the last few years that we've seen. We've started out with the pandemic, and then there is the situation in Europe, then there is the whole thing around the cost of living crisis, and then everywhere else that it has been going on, and multiple such examples. And all of these seem to be coming in as very, very crises. Just as you get off one, you seem to be having another one out there. Now, given so much of this flux, and by the way, we've had so much digital transformation because of the pandemic and the likes, given all of this flux, plus the fact that a large part of the world considers that it's now multipolar, there are a lot of major cyber threats in the world. We have to be cautious of, and we have to prepare for this to outlive cyber combat for supremacy in some sense. What are your thoughts around this, Steve?
Yeah, there's been a huge amount of change, hasn't there? And I think that, one of the things that we have to be very conscious of is just mental fatigue around all of that from a people perspective. Our ability to continually respond to all of these different things that are happening. And as you just said, it really is quite relentless. And then it is one after another. So with that in mind, we at the ISF took a slightly different approach in terms of looking out from our threat horizon perspective last year. We tried to come up with some different scenarios instead that tried to really help people to focus on some of the bigger sort of contexts, if I could put it that way, that they should be focused on from a threat standpoint. And we put them into three big categories. The first was to do just with the future of work, the sorts of changes you've been talking about, digital transformation, hybrid working, and so on. The second one was around data, the future of data, because that really does drive everything that we do. And then the third was around, geopolitics, which you've mentioned there. In the first one, in that element of work, I think one of the threats I would pull out there is this lack of control from the security standpoint that we've had to adapt to. Because we have people, doesn't matter what business that you're in a hybrid working environment, the CISO, the security team, has even less control over what's happening at the end user end than they used to. And we've seen a temptation to try to monitor more. I'm not a fan of that. We've seen a temptation to try to drag people back into an office environment from a control standpoint. I think that in an environment where we have skill shortages, there is an immense amount of empathy and fine touch that is now needed in order to manage that future of work environment. Now, security people are probably not best placed to do that. There are some CEOs out there that I would also say are not best placed to do that. So we have to lean very much more on getting help and advice from experts in that space. So that's one particular threat. What exactly does the future of work look like, and how do we manage that effectively from a security standpoint? The second is around data. The biggest threat, the biggest thing that concerns me around data is not loss of data. I can handle that. It's where data has been manipulated. Because we've just spent a lot of time talking about artificial intelligence that feeds off data. We talk about very much more decision-making needing to be data-driven. And so if you were really looking to either take down somebody's infrastructure, to hamper their efforts in terms of new product development, expansion, you would probably go into some form of data manipulation, which is exceptionally hard to find through all the millions and millions of lines of code that exist out there. And so again, the only thing that we can do from a security standpoint is try to make sure that we can recover from it. And you'll notice I'm not saying prevent it happening, because I don't think we can. So the focus switches to recovery and resilience. And how do we make sure that our organizations can keep functioning in the way that they need to? And then that third area, that geopolitical one, the biggest threat I'd pull out of that is in the supply chain. Now, I've been talking about supply chain threat for quite some while, and I'm still surprised that it hasn't risen to the level of importance that I think it deserves. But certainly the situation in the Ukraine, I think, did shine a very, very sharp light and provided focus on that particular challenge. It's a difficult one for us to solve because we have multiple levels of supplier, tier ones, twos, threes, and beyond. We may not even know who some of those suppliers are. That's the reality of the supply chain as far as we're concerned today. So again, I think what we have to do from the security standpoint is to focus in on what is most important. What are the things that we absolutely have to have working effectively? And focus on that first, because otherwise we're going to exhaust ourselves. And we can't do that alone. We have to work much more closely with the business in determining where these pinch points might be. And I think that actually will have some benefit because it gives us more credibility from the security standpoint, gives us better insight into the way in which the business is evolving. And it also helps business leaders to articulate some of the real challenges that they have in the event of supply chains not functioning and not working. So, when I look at the overall landscape, there's no shortage of threat out there. But I think trying to break it down into some bigger areas and pulling out some key threats that may or may not apply to different organizations. And I think this is another important piece. There is no one size fits all. So we have to be involved in looking at the risk profile that our organization has, how that aligns to strategy, and being, I think, very much more brave in the way that we challenge from the security standpoint, clearly in a constructive fashion. And again, that I think will really lead to a whole range of different benefits, not just for security, but for the business in general.
So you said about your focus is going to be not so much on prevention. It's going to be more of recovery and in some sense, resiliency. So besides all of this level of volatility that we spoke across these multiple spaces, across geopolitical, the digital transformations and technology transformations and data, I'm sure that there are several other emerging threats. So what do you think are some of the things that we have to take as actions for cyber resiliency to help thwart some of these emerging threats? And how can organizations champion them?
I think that there are many things that we can do. I would just focus on two. I think the first thing is knowing what is absolutely fundamental to the organization to keep it running. That could be data, it could be people, it could be a variety of different things. It would be different for different organizations, but you have to know that and you have to try to protect it to the extent that you can and have recovery plans in place for the day when something goes wrong. So laser focus on what's important from a business standpoint. That has benefit. It gets the attention of the board of directors. Absolutely. Because they understand the risk register that the company is operating to. And so aligning some of that with the way in which they're viewing things gets you that buy-in from the top. And that's something that we absolutely have to have. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we talk a lot about at the ISF at the moment is simulation. So role playing, producing the playbook for how you respond to a cyber incident, and then putting that into a simulation exercise where you do have the right level of individuals that are going to have to respond in the moment. And you don't allow them to suddenly, go off and look through all of the different reams of backup material that might have, because in reality, that won't happen. There are lots of people out there that provide those simulation exercises. We've been doing them all around the world for quite some time. But what is interesting, I think, for me, is where we've taken it to the next stage that says, how does the organization we're working with today compare with other ISF members on an anonymized basis? Or how does one department compare with another department? And how can we put in place an improvement plan? Because nobody gets it right first time. What we're looking to do is to constantly evolve and get better, right? So having that form of measurement in place that is provided objectively along with the remediation and then following that up in, say, 6 months' time so that we can track how we've improved, I think has certainly moved us on in the way that we run some of those exercises, and I think adds incredible value to the organization. So yeah, I think it's about, understanding what's really important. How do you recover from something that affects it, and then playing that one out, spending time on the training field, if you like, and making sure that everybody knows their role and how they're going to respond, and then helping them to become superior athletes in that particular space, which is would probably cause some boards to smile a little if they look around at each other.
Oh, absolutely. It's just drills, and more drills, and with all kind of scenarios played out across those drills. I think absolutely you're spot on that one, and I think it gives me some comfort that we as Infosys, I think some of the things that we've been having during this conversation around making sure that we have the awareness, making sure we know we have the laser focus on exactly what's important, and making sure that that's the one which we go and focus on, running the simulations, so that people don't go back and figure out, what's going on, but being out there and being able to go ahead and respond in the manner that is required is what we have been. So in some sense, it's comforting, but this is not a field where you can ever be sure, is it? So I think that's been the nature of how things have evolved in cybersecurity per se, Stephen. I see that. And I think going back, you said that you're also now championing regulation and laws, right? And we're seeing that because of the hybrid work culture in place, because of the fact that we have to be on top of our security game. There will be consequences in terms of regulatory non-compliance. There are recent regulatory changes that have been brought in worldwide. In different parts of the world, there have been recent changes that have been brought in some sense. And there are more and more stringent laws which are coming in to further strengthen the governance and accountability across all organizations. So do you think that these are sufficient? Do you think there's more to go? What are the different stakeholders who are involved? Are they all the right ones? And what else are your thoughts around this, Steve?
Yeah, I think that regulation has a role to play. I'm not a huge fan. I do support it in certain areas, but I don't think I'll ever be a fan. And the reason for that is very simple. And that is, there is always the temptation in the boardroom to fall back on, well, what do I have to do to be compliant? And compliance is all about driving the car looking in the rearview mirror, because regulators work off what happened yesterday. And if we work in a very fast-moving, fast-changing environment, you need to keep your eyes looking out the windscreen. Occasionally you look backwards because you want to see what's coming up from behind, but you've got to keep looking forwards. And regulation isn't going to help you there. So it's about balance again. It's about saying, okay, I understand compliance is necessary. And for those people listening to this, who are working in, say, a financial services space, huge amount of regulation in there. Some would say more than they actually need. I don't think that's the case, but I do sympathize. Others are also regulated. So compliance, yes, gets you the tick in the box. But it's much, much more than that in security these days. We have to be anticipating. We have to be looking forward. Again, that comes back to the business. So the responsibility of the board of directors, of the C-suite in an organization, is to really understand what they have to do from a compliance standpoint and what they also need to do from a risk management perspective in order to be successful and deliver on their strategy. And they have to get that right. That's the judgment call in the boardroom. That's not the job of the CISO. The CISO's job is to provide the right level of information and input, but the responsibility is in the boardroom. And that's hugely important, I think, to bear in mind at both ends. So where does all of that leave us? I think it leaves us in a position where, from the organization, we need to be focusing very hard on our crown jewels, what is important to us, how we protect that, how we get the message across that it's important throughout our business, throughout our employee base, stakeholder base. I think it's also important, particularly for larger organizations that have seen some of the things that have, emerged and developed, to proactively work with regulatory bodies. Now, in different parts of the world, that is easier said than done. Some regulatory bodies are very, very open to collaborative working. For me, that is actually the way forward. We have to have regulatory bodies working with public, private sector in a very open and transparent fashion for the good of the industry, not for the sake of constraining, because you don't want to do that. And the only way that a regulator will ever come to understand that is if they start listening to what's going on actually at the coalface. And some of them are very good at that, and some are not so good at it. So there's room for improvement in that space, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to stifle innovation. You know, we've just spent quite some while talking about really exciting developments in technology. There are people listening to this who are hugely entrepreneurial, who are innovating on an ongoing basis. You don't want to temper and hamper that, but you want to make sure that they understand how they can influence the way in which regulation might be developed so that they stay on the right side of it. So there's a lot more work to be done, I think, in getting the right people together at the right time to thrash some of these things out. And the benefit is then that regulation is actually fit for purpose. And, you know, the last thing you want is regulation going out there that you then need to change, because that is a dreadful process to be involved in and very time consuming, frustrating, and not somewhere you need to go. So the answer is get it right first time, get the right people involved. It sounds very easy, doesn't it? But I know it isn't.
Absolutely, absolutely. But everything that you've done, actually, by the way, Steve, does make it sound very easy, but I know that there's so much work that you've been putting in over the years. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Kavitha.
Thanks to the Infosys team for speaking with Steve this week. If you want to help support the ISF podcast, we'd be pleased if you'd give us a 5-star rating and write a quick review. Thanks in advance. And be sure to check out the ISF Analyst Insight podcast, which goes in-depth on the hottest topics in information security. In every episode, ISF analysts hand-select active security professionals from ISF member organizations to discuss how the implementation of ISF research uniquely applies to their real-world context. We hope you'll listen. Check out the show notes for a link. And feel free to get in touch. You can contact us at securityforum.org. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox Productions and Tavia Gilbert, with senior producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Additional support from Mandy Moorish, Oscar Falk, and Brian Wilson. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Thanks for listening.